A short word before we begin. What you are about to hear is a work of fiction set in Regency England between the years 1811 and 1820. Any resemblance to real persons living or dead is the work of imagination alone. Listener discretion is advised for themes of social pressure and forbidden affection. Settle in, dim the lights if you can. This is no place for you, said the Duke. And yet, she answered, here I am. The candles in the long gallery shuddered, as if a window had been opened somewhere they could not see. No one moved. The king himself, whose word had filled that room only a moment before, did not speak. He looked at the Duke. He looked at the woman in the muslin gown, the colour of bruised peaches, and for the length of 3 slow breaths, the most powerful man in England held his tongue. She did not lower her eyes. That, more than the answer she had given, was the thing the room would remember. Tonight, on Stories of Love and Secrets, the tale of a girl who walked into a chamber she had no right to enter, and of the man who had spent half his life learning not to want what he was about to lose. A duke bound by an old promise, a young woman bound by a letter she should never have read, and a king who at the most delicate hour of his reign must decide whether to permit a love that disturbs the order of things, or to break it cleanly, as one breaks the seal of an envelope one would rather not have received. Tell me, before the first chapter begins, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, the city, the hour, the window you are sitting beside. I read each one late when the work is done and the house is quiet. Take a moment, leave the word, and then come back. I will wait. Are you settled? Then let us begin. Chapter 1. The Letter She Never Sent. The morning the letter arrived, Arabella Wentworth was at the long table in the breakfast room of Larkbourne House, drying the back of a teaspoon on the corner of her napkin, because the maid had polished it badly and a smear of tarnish bothered her in a way she would not have admitted aloud. Her father, Lord Wentworth, was reading aloud from the Morning Post. Her mother was not listening. Her younger sister Cecily was building a small architecture of toast crumbs around the rim of her plate. The post was set down at the head of the table, 3 letters for her father, one on heavier paper than the rest, sealed in deep blue wax, bearing an unfamiliar crest, addressed to no one at all. What an odd thing, said Lord Wentworth, frowning. No name. Perhaps the writer forgot, said her mother lightly. No one forgets a name on a letter sealed in this kind of wax. He turned it once in his hand, slowly, as though weighing it. Arabella found that she had not breathed in some time. The crest on the seal, 3 thin lines that crossed beneath what might have been a crown or might have been a pair of folded wings, was not familiar to her, and yet some quiet part of her behaved as if it were. Her teaspoon was perfectly clean now. She kept polishing it. I shall return it to the post, her father said at last, and let them puzzle over it. We do not open what is not ours. He set the letter on the silver tray by the window beside the morning candle that had not yet been put out. He went on with the Morning Post. The crest of blue wax burned mildly, in the corner of Arabella's vision for the rest of breakfast. She rose when the meal ended, and pressed her hand once to the back of her mother's chair as she passed, and said something about a walk in the orchard. None of this was strictly a lie. She did walk in the orchard. She walked the long way around, past the morning room, past the breakfast room, past the silver tray. She did not pick up the letter then. She walked past it. It is one of the small cruelties of a well-bred girl's life that her temptations must always be visited twice. The first time is for the conscience. The second time is for the deed. She walked the orchard once, and then she walked it again, and on the second turn she was already inside the house, and her hand was already on the heavy blue seal, and she was already telling herself, quite calmly, that she would only look at the first line. The first line read, "To whomever finds this letter, and is not afraid." She read the second line. By the time she had read the third, she had carried the letter up to her own room and closed the door behind her, and was sitting on the edge of her bed with her knees pressed close together, the way she used to sit as a child when she was hiding the fact that she was about to cry. The letter was not long. The handwriting was a man's, square and disciplined, with 1 or 2 letters, the lowercase g, the capital S, leaning very slightly forward, as if the writer's patience had been tested while he wrote them. It spoke of an arrangement that had been broken, of a promise made between 2 great houses, of a young woman who had never been told what had been decided for her on her behalf before she was old enough to refuse. It named no one. It did not need to. The letter knew her name in the way that ghosts know one's name, not by being told, but by being implied. When she had finished reading, she sat very still. The clock on the mantel ticked. A wood pigeon called twice from somewhere out beyond the orchard. Her hands in her lap were very cold. She placed the letter, folded once, between the pages of her prayer book, not out of any piety, but because the prayer book was the only object in the room she trusted herself never to lend. She did not write a reply. She wrote that afternoon a letter she would not send. She wrote it twice. She burned the first one, she kept the second one folded inside the same prayer book. It read in part, "I do not know who you are, sir, and I do not know what has been done in my name. But you have spoken to me, and so I shall speak to you, even if my voice never leaves this room. If a promise was made and broken, I would know the shape of it. I would know whose hands held the broken halves." She signed it only with her initials, A.W., and underneath in a smaller hand, as though she had been almost ashamed to add it, "A girl who is not afraid." It is from that letter, the one she never sent, that everything else will follow. The carriage at the gate 3 weeks later will follow from it. The first meeting in the rose garden, the interview with her father, the night ride through Hampshire, the chamber at St. James's, the candles trembling, the king holding his tongue. But on that first afternoon she did not know any of this. She only knew that someone, somewhere, had told her a truth about her own life that no one in her own house had ever thought to tell her. She knew the small, dangerous warmth that comes when a stranger sees you more clearly than your own father has, and she knew, because she was an honest girl in the privacy of her own mind, that she would not stop now. She had read the first line. She had crossed the threshold. The letter could not be unread. She went down to dinner that evening. She smiled at her mother. She passed the salt to her father. She agreed that the new curate had a pleasing voice. She felt the prayer book on her bedside table from 3 rooms away, the way one feels a hot coal one has set down too near the rug. She did not yet know the name of the man who had written to her. His name was Alistair Sinclair, 4th Duke of Halcourt. And at the very hour, Arabella was opening the blue seal in her bedroom. He was standing in the cold library of his townhouse, with his hands flat on the polished surface of a writing desk, telling himself that he had done the most foolish thing of his life, and that he could not, in honour, undo it. Chapter 2. A Duke in his own library. The Duke of Halcourt was 31 years old. He was not tall in the way that drawing-rooms admire. He was tall in the way that men who have done long walks alone are tall, with the shoulders carried a little forward, as though he were used to weather. His hair was dark and worn slightly longer than fashion preferred. His eyes were the deep, unsettled blue of the sea before a summer storm. He had been a duke for 9 years. He had been a man who slept well for none of them. He had a face that women looked at twice in church and then looked away from quickly, and then looked at again from behind their fans. He knew this and was tired of it. He had spent the better part of a decade trying to be useful to the estate, to the crown, to the small string of villages along the Halcourt Valley that depended on his accounts and his patience, and he had discovered, with no satisfaction, that being useful was not the same as being free. The promise had been made when he was 22 and his father was dying. He remembered the room, the smell of camphor and damp wool, the candle guttering against the brass of the bedside lamp, his father's hand on his wrist, a hand that had once lifted him onto a horse and now could not lift a teacup. His father had spoken in a low, urgent voice. There was a debt, not of money, a debt of honour, owed to the late Lord Wentworth, Arabella's grandfather, for a kindness done in a difficult year. The houses had agreed quietly that the debt would be settled in the next generation, a match, a marriage, when the girl was of age. No one had ever told the girl, no one had ever told her father fully. The 2 old men had agreed it between them, in the way men of their kind once agreed things, on a handshake and a glass of port, and the assumption that their sons would honour the bond. His father had died that night. The next morning Alistair had become the Duke, and the keeper of the promise, and the only living man on his side of the bargain who knew that it existed. For 9 years he had said nothing. For 9 years he had watched Arabella Wentworth from a distance at a hunt ball when she was 16 and laughed too loudly at one of her sister's jokes, at a charity concert when she was 18 and sang the second verse of a hymn with her eyes closed, at a winter assembly when she was 20 and refused, with a politeness that had teeth in it, to dance with a man twice her age who had drunk too much claret. He had watched her become the woman she was, and the more he watched, the more impossible the promise became. He could go to her father. He could say, in the dry voice of a man discharging an unpleasant duty, that an arrangement existed, and that it was his honour as his father's son to fulfil it. Her father would be flattered. Her mother would weep with joy. The girl would be asked, in the language of well-bred girls' askings, whether she could find it in her heart to consent. She would say yes. Of course she would say yes. He was a duke. He was 31 and unmarried, and not unkind to look at. And he came with 3 estates and a seat in the Lords and the warm respect of the regent himself. She would say yes because she did not know how to say no to a thing the entire world would call her good fortune, and that, exactly that, was the thing Alistair Sinclair could not bear. He had decided on a wet evening in March that he would not present himself in that fashion. He would not be the conclusion of a sum she had not been allowed to do. If she was to come to him, she would come knowing. If she was to refuse him, she would refuse knowing. He owed her, at the very least, the chance to be the author of her own answer. And so he had written the letter, the one with the blue seal, the one with no name on it. It had taken him 11 drafts. He had not signed it. He had told her only the shape of the promise, not the names. He had given her, in effect, the key to a door, without telling her which door. He had trusted, and this was the foolish part, the part for which his old tutor would have struck him. He had trusted that a girl who was not afraid would find the door on her own. He stood that morning in his own library, with his hands flat on the desk, and he allowed himself the only luxury he permitted himself in private. He closed his eyes for the count of 10. The library smelled, as it always smelled, of beeswax and old paper, and the faint, almost imperceptible smoke of the small fire he kept lit even in spring, because the room faced north and his mother had hated to be cold. His mother had been dead for 17 years. He still kept the fire lit for her. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a steady one, and the difference, he had come to believe, was small. A knock at the door. His secretary, Mr. Halbrook, with the morning's correspondence on a silver tray. Alistair opened his eyes. He took the tray. He thanked the man, who withdrew. He set the tray on the corner of the desk. He did not look at the letters for a long moment. The light from the tall window fell across the green leather of the blotter and made a long, pale rectangle of it. He watched the rectangle, he thought. She will have read it by now. She will have read it, or she will have burned it without opening it, and either way the thing is done. He did not yet know which she had chosen. He went to the window. He stood with his hands clasped behind him, in the posture of a man who has trained himself out of the habit of fidgeting below in the square. A maid was beating a small rug against the iron railings. An old man with a black dog was walking very slowly along the pavement. A curricle drawn by 2 greys swept around the corner with the careless dash of a young man who had not yet learned to be careful with horses. The world was going on. The world did not know that the Duke of Halcourt had 3 nights before slipped a letter under his own door with his own hand and walked it down to the post like a thief and stood at the corner of Wigmore Street watching the boy carry it away as though it were the last hour of a battle he had been losing for 9 years. He thought, with a small and almost private kind of pleasure, that whatever happened next, the choice would no longer be only his. The fire snapped once in the grate. He turned from the window. He sat down at the desk. He began, with the discipline of a man who has been raised never to waste a morning, to open the rest of his post. 3 rooms away, on a side table in the smaller drawing-room, was a second letter, this one sealed in ordinary red wax and addressed in his own hand to His Majesty the King. He had written it the night before. He had not yet sent it. He had not yet decided whether he would. That decision, too, was coming. Chapter 3. The Rose Garden in the Rain. 3 weeks passed in which nothing visible happened. Arabella attended a dinner at the Pembertons. She sat for a portrait that her mother had been planning for 2 years. She walked in the orchard, she read the letter twice more, and then put the prayer book away on the high shelf, and then took it down again, and then put it away again, and then resolved, with the kind of resolution one makes in the dark at 4 in the morning, that she would do nothing at all. She would let the matter rest. She would forget it. She did not forget it. On the 4th Tuesday after the letter, a card was left at Larkbourne House. It bore no name, only an hour and a place, 3 in the afternoon. The lower rose garden at Halcourt Park. The card was addressed to her in the same square, disciplined handwriting she had now read so many times that she could have drawn the lowercase g with her eyes closed. Halcourt Park lay 7 miles to the north across the river. She had passed it twice in her life, both times in a carriage with her mother, both times told not to stare. The Duke was, by reputation, a quiet man. He did not give balls. He did not race horses. He had once, it was said, refused an invitation from the Regent on the grounds that he was reading a book he did not wish to interrupt. Whether this was true, or merely the kind of story that London liked to tell about men, it could not flatter. Arabella did not know. She knew only that the card, when she held it, was warm, that the wax had been pressed with the same crest as the letter, and that she had decided, before she had finished reading it, that she would go. She told her mother that she had been invited to take tea with Miss Pemberton. She told the groom to bring round the smaller carriage. She wore the muslin gown, the colour of bruised peaches, because it was the gown in which she looked least like a girl who had been told what to do all her life, and most like a woman who had decided something for herself. She wore her grandmother's small amber cross at her throat because she had a private notion that her grandmother, a woman who had once ridden across Spain with a husband at war, would have approved. It began to rain a 1/4 of a mile before she reached the gates. She thought briefly of turning back. She did not. She arrived at Halcourt Park in a thin grey rain that had soaked the shoulders of her pelisse and darkened the colour of the bruised peach muslin until it looked, in the half-light, almost the colour of dried blood. A footman opened the carriage door. She refused, with a small movement of her hand, the umbrella he offered. She did not want to arrive at this meeting under another man's shelter. The lower rose garden lay behind the house, screened from the windows by a long yew hedge. It was the kind of garden a woman who had loved roses had once planted, and which a son who did not know quite what to do with it had kept exactly as she had left it. The roses in late May were just beginning. The smell of them, mixed with the smell of wet earth and bruised lavender, was the first thing she would always remember about him, even before his voice. He was standing at the far end of the gravel walk. He wore a dark coat, no hat. His hair was wet. He had been there by the look of him for some time. He did not move towards her when she came through the gate. He waited, she thought, walking the long gravel walk in the rain, with her wet skirt clinging to her ankles and her amber cross cold against her throat, that he was the first man in her adult life who had not stepped towards her to take charge of an encounter. It made her, in a way she did not have words for, less afraid, not more. When she reached him, she stopped at the distance polite society would have permitted, that is to say, an arm's length and a careful inch. The rain made a thin, almost musical sound on the broad leaves around them. Somewhere, behind the yew hedge, a thrush was singing in spite of the weather. "You came," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, not theatrical, worn. It was the voice of a man who used words sparingly because he had learned somewhere that words spent too freely lost their value. "I came," she said. She had prepared in the carriage a small speech. She had prepared 3. She delivered none of them. She looked instead at his face, at the storm-blue eyes that did not look away from hers, at the small scar at the corner of his mouth that she had not known about, at the way his jaw had set itself very slightly as if he were holding something heavy and did not wish her to see the effort of it. "You wrote to me," she said. "I did. Why no name?" "Because, madam," he said, "if I had given you my name, you would not have come. You would have done what your family expected. I needed to know first whether you were the kind of woman who would come at all." It was, she thought, the rudest sentence anyone had ever said to her. It was also the most honest. She was not sure which of those two qualities had made her suddenly want to laugh. "And am I," she said, "the kind of woman who comes?" "You are standing here," he said, "in the rain, in a gown that will be ruined, having lied to your mother about a tea party with Miss Pemberton. I should say the matter is settled." She did laugh then. A single surprised breath of a laugh. The thrush in the yew hedge stopped singing for a moment as if startled, and then began again, lower. He told her then, standing in the rain, that neither of them moved to leave. The whole shape of the promise, the 2 old men, the handshake, the debt that was not money, the agreement that had been made on her behalf in a candlelit bedroom in Hampshire when she was 3 years old and learning to say the word strawberry. He did not embellish. He did not soften. He told her also why he had not come to her father in the ordinary way. He told her about the answer she would have been forced to give and about the way that answer would have sat in her mouth for the rest of her life like a coin she had been made to swallow. "I would rather you refused me," he said, knowing, than accepted me, not knowing. She thought about that for a long time. The rain ran down the back of her neck. She did not move. "And if I do refuse," she said at last, "then the promise dies with us," he said. "I shall consider the debt discharged by your having been told you will go home. We shall not meet again except in the way that any 2 people meet in passing, in a country where everyone is known to everyone." She studied his face. She tried to find, in the storm blue of his eyes, the slightest pressure of a man bargaining. She found none. He had said what he had said, and he meant it, and he was waiting. "And if I do not refuse," she said. He did not answer immediately. The thrush sang, the rain thinned, a petal fell somewhere in the bed behind him with the small, distinct sound petals make when they fall onto wet gravel. "Then we begin," he said very quietly. "A conversation that will be the longest conversation of either of our lives, and we shall not for any reason hurry it." She felt, in that moment, the small dangerous warmth she had felt the first time she had opened his letter, and she understood finally what it was. It was the warmth of being treated as a person who had time, no one in her life. Not her parents, not her sister, not the curate, not the dancing master, not the boys who had handed her into carriages had ever, in any small thing, behaved as though she had time. They had wanted her decisions quickly, her smiles quickly, her acceptances and refusals quickly, her opinions polished and ready. This man had given her, with a single sentence, the gift of slowness.
"I have not refused," she said.
He bowed. It was not the bow of a duke to a young lady. It was the smaller, quieter bow of a man to a person whose answer he has chosen to wait for. He turned. He walked her back to the carriage. He did not take her arm. He did not offer his coat at the carriage door. He said, "Only I shall write. Read what comes. Burn it if you must, but read it first." And he closed the door and he stepped back, and the carriage moved off, and she did not look back because she did not trust her face. She did not need to look back. She knew with the clean clarity of a girl who has finally been spoken to as a woman that he was watching her go. Chapter 4. The 3 letters. He wrote 3 letters in the next month. None of them were love letters, and all of them were. The first was about his mother. He told her about the woman who had planted the rose garden, about the way she had kept the fire lit in the North Library even in spring, about the small, unembellished cross she had worn at her throat, which had been buried with her, and which he sometimes foolishly missed as though it had been a person. He wrote of her so that Arabella would understand that he had been loved once by a woman of great quiet, and that he knew therefore what such love looked like, and what its absence cost. The second was about his estate. He told her about the village of Halcourt Combe, about the schoolmaster who had been there since he himself was a boy, about the new well he had paid for the previous winter, about the 4 cottages whose roofs had failed in the last storm, and which he had not yet repaired because the slate man was ill and he would not give the work to a stranger. He wrote of all this so that she would understand that the man who had asked her to take her time was a man who already had a great many things that were taking his. The third was about her. It was the shortest, and it had cost him the most. He had written it, torn it, rewritten it. He had not allowed himself flowers. He had not allowed himself the language a duke at 31 would have at his disposal if he had wished to use it. He had written, instead, only this: "I do not know yet who you are. I know that you came in the rain. I know that you laughed once at the rudest thing I have ever said. I know that you wear your grandmother's cross. I know that the color of your gown that afternoon was the color of a particular fruit that grew when I was a boy in my mother's south wall, and which I have not seen since. I do not need you to be a great beauty, or a great wit, or a great anything at all. I need only to be allowed to learn you, slowly, in the manner I have described. If at any point in that learning you wish me to stop, you have only to write the word and I shall." He signed it, this time with his name, the whole of it. Alistair Sinclair, Halcourt. She read each letter twice. She read the third one 7 times. She kept them in the prayer book, with the unsent letter she had written to him, and she found after some weeks that the prayer book had become the only object in her bedroom she could not bear to leave unattended. She wrote back to all 3. She wrote about her sister Cecily, who was 18 and in love with the wrong man, and about her father, who was a kinder man than he allowed himself to be in company, and about her mother, who was a sadder woman than her smile permitted. She wrote about the orchard at Larkbourne, about the late frost that had killed half the plum blossom, about a horse called Quincy, whose left ear had been bitten by another horse the previous summer, and which she had nursed back to health herself with goose fat and patience. She wrote about her own fear, once, only once, that she would die without having ever in her life made a decision that was entirely her own. He read her letters in his North Library, by the fire his mother had loved, and he understood that he had become, without permission and without intention, a man entirely altered. He had never expected, at 31, to be altered by anything. He had expected to be confirmed. The discovery that the world still held the power to change him, after he had assumed himself finished, sat strangely in his chest and would not settle. It would not have been a secret long. In any case, London was a small place. A footman at Larkbourne talked to a footman at Halcourt. A maid at one inn carried a letter to a maid at another. By midsummer there were murmurs at 2 clubs and 3 drawing-rooms, and by August the matter had reached the only ear in England that mattered. The regent for the king himself was unwell that summer, and the prince was acting in his name, sent for the Duke of Halcourt on a Friday morning in early September. The note arrived at 9:30. It was brief. It did not say what it was about. Alistair knew. He went. Chapter 5. The Summons. St. James's at 10 in the morning had the particular kind of quiet that very public buildings have when they are not yet performing. The gilt was unlit by candle. The crimson carpets, which by evening would look like a slow river, looked at that hour merely heavy. The guards did not look at him as he passed. They never did. The Duke had been a familiar figure in those corridors since he was 22, and the men in red knew not to mark him with even a flicker of recognition. Their work, in part, was to behave as if no one had ever come or gone. The regent received him in the smaller chamber off the long gallery. It was a room of green silk and dark portraits, with one tall window that gave onto a private garden and a fire that was lit only because the prince was always cold. The prince himself stood at the window. He did not turn when Alistair was announced. "Halcourt," he said. "Sir, sit if you wish." "I shall stand, sir, as you like." There was a long silence. The prince watched the garden. A small, indifferent rain was falling at length. Without turning, he spoke.
"There is a young woman, Halcourt." "Yes, sir." "A Miss Wentworth." "Yes, sir." "I am told that you have been writing to her without, I gather, the formal knowledge of her father." "That is so, sir. I am also told that there exists between your father's estate and hers an old promise that you are in some private fashion fulfilling it, or in some other private fashion refusing to." Alistair did not answer immediately. The prince, still at the window, made a small, almost weary gesture with one hand. "Speak." "I am, sir, doing neither," he said. "I am giving her the chance to choose."
The prince turned then at last. He was a heavy man, and not a kind one, and his eyes were the unhappy eyes of a man who had been told since boyhood that he was the most important person in any room, and who had begun, in middle age, to suspect that this had not been quite true. "A duke," he said, "does not give a country girl a chance to choose. A duke chooses." "The country girl is then informed." Alistair did not reply. "You will end this, Halcourt. There are other matches I have in mind for you. There are matches the Crown has reason to prefer. You understand me?" "I understand you, sir." "Then we are done." "Sir," said Alistair very quietly, "we are not." The prince's face changed. It did not redden, it whitened. He was not a man who was often answered in that tone, and he was not a man who knew with any grace what to do when he was. "Have a care, Halcourt." "Sir, I have had care. I have had care for 9 years. I am asking your permission, with the deepest respect a subject can give, to be permitted to continue what I have begun. And if I do not give it, then I shall come, sir, with the lady on a day of your choosing, into a room of your choosing, and I shall ask the question in the open before the king. If the king is well enough, before yourself, if not, and I shall ask it once, and clearly, and I shall abide by the answer." The prince looked at him for a long time. The rain on the window grew briefly heavier, then thinned. At length the prince said, in a voice that surprised them both with its dryness, "You will, I suppose, do as you say?" "I shall, sir." "Then come, bring her. The king is well enough this week, Friday next, 5 o'clock, the long gallery. We shall hear you both." He turned again to the window. The audience was ended. Alistair bowed. He walked the long, crimson corridor back to the courtyard. He did not, until he had reached his own carriage and closed its door behind him, allow himself the small, private tremor of the hand he had been holding still for the better part of an hour. He wrote to her that evening. He did not soften. He wrote simply, "Friday next, 5 o'clock, St. James's, the long gallery. The regent will be present. The king, if he is well also, we shall be asked questions. I shall not lie. I shall not flatter. I shall not give you up unless you give me up. If you wish to refuse, write tonight. If you wish to come, send word by morning. Whatever you choose, I am, as I have been, in admiration of the choice itself." He sent it. He sat by the fire in the North Library. He did not sleep. At 7 in the morning, a small, plain envelope arrived, in a hand he had come to know as well as his own. It contained one line: "I shall come. A. W." Chapter 6. The Long Gallery. It would be said afterwards by those who had been there that the most striking thing was not what was said. It was the silence at the beginning. The long gallery at St. James's at 5 in the afternoon in late September was lit by 2 great chandeliers and by the last oblique light of a sun that had been thin all day. There were perhaps 15 people in the room. The prince, the king, very pale, in a high-backed chair near the fire, attended by his physician, who stood discreetly at the wall. 2 of the king's older advisers, white-haired men who had served 3 monarchs and would not, in their long lives, be surprised by very much. A clerk, with a small ledger, prepared to record only what was necessary and to forget the rest. A pair of senior household officers in dark coats, whose presence was understood and never explained. Lord Wentworth, who had been summoned that morning, and who did not yet entirely understand why he was there, but who had been a member of the House of Lords for 30 years, and knew how to stand in a royal room as if he were unsurprised by anything. Lady Wentworth, who had wept once in the carriage on the way and then composed herself, and whose hand in her glove had not stopped trembling. Cecily Wentworth, who had insisted with a fierce, frightened loyalty Arabella would never forget on coming, and who now stood half a pace behind her sister, very straight, very pale, with her chin lifted in a way that made her look very like the grandmother who had once ridden across Spain. And at the centre of the long polished floor, the Duke and the girl Arabella wore a gown of deep cream silk, with the amber cross at her throat. Her hair had been dressed simply in side ringlets that fell to her collar with a single dark green ribbon. She had not slept either. She did not look, however, like a woman who had not slept. She looked like a woman who had spent the small hours of the night putting away, very carefully, every part of herself she would not need that afternoon, and who had brought only what was essential. The Duke beside her wore a coat of unrelieved navy, no ornament except the small ring on his little finger that had been his father's. His storm blue eyes did not move from the king's face. He had decided, in the carriage, that he would not look at Arabella in that room. Not because he did not wish to, because he wished to make plain to every person watching that what was being asked without any pressure from his eyes upon hers. The regent, in his chair beside the king, made the small, dry gesture that meant, "Begin." A door at the far end of the gallery opened. A footman, in scarlet, withdrew silently. There was a small movement of skirts. A chair scraped, the clerk dipped his pen, and then from the doorway through which Arabella and the Duke had not entered, from a small side door that almost no one in the room had noticed, there came a sudden light step, a woman's step. A woman in a travelling cloak, still dusty from the road, with her hood thrown back, walked, without announcement, the length of the long gallery towards them. She was perhaps 50. She wore black. She had very plainly been weeping, but she had not stopped to repair her face. Her eyes, and Arabella, even afterwards, would not be able to say how she knew this so quickly, were the same storm blue as the Duke's. A small sound from the Duke beside her, not a word, something less. "Forgive me, sir," said the woman, addressing the regent, but looking only at Alistair. "I came as fast as the horses could carry me. I would not, for any matter less than this, have come at all." "Madam," said the regent, slowly, "you are." "I am, sir," said the woman, "the late Duke's sister. I have lived these 20 years in Bruges. I came because I have learned only this last fortnight what my brother promised on his deathbed, and what my nephew in his honour has been carrying since he was 22. And I have come, sir, to say what no one in this kingdom has the right to say but I, who was in that room when the promise was made." The room did not move. "There was a debt, sir. There was a kindness. My brother spoke of it, in his fever, more largely than it was. The Wentworth grandfather was a good man, but the debt he was owed was not a debt of a marriage. It was a debt of 2 horses, sir, lent at a time when my brother could not buy them, and never returned. I know this because I was the one who, the next morning, paid them back, out of my own portion, before I left for the Low Countries. The debt has not existed, sir, for 23 years. My nephew has been carrying a promise that, in plain account, was discharged before he was 9 years old." She turned then to Alistair. Her face changed. The formality went out of it. She became, for one moment in that long gallery, only an aunt who had not seen her sister's son in 20 years. "Alistair," she said, "whatever you are doing here, my dear, I have not come to undo it. I have come only to take the obligation off your shoulders. What you do now, you do as a free man, and not as your father's debtor. I should have come sooner. I am sorry." The Duke did not speak. His jaw, which had been set further. He bowed to her, a small, careful bow that contained, for those who knew how to read such things, the whole of a man's gratitude. It was at this moment that the king himself, who had not spoken since the gallery filled, lifted his head a little in his high-backed chair, and looked, with the slow attention of an old man who has decided to be present, at Arabella.
"Child,"
he said. His voice was thin but clear. "You have heard what has been said. I have, your majesty. Then you owe this man nothing, not a curtsy, not a word. You may leave this room without speaking, and no person here shall hold it against you." Arabella stood very still. The chandeliers shed their small, even light. The clerk's pen had not moved. Lady Wentworth had stopped breathing. The regent watched her with the unsentimental interest of a man who has had a long career in watching people decide things. "Your Majesty," said Arabella at length. Her voice was lower than she had expected. She did not let it tremble. She did not let it strengthen artificially either. She let it be the voice that came. "I came to this room," she said, "because a man wrote to me when I was 22 and had never been written to in my life, as if I were a person who could be trusted with a truth. He did not tell me his name. He told me only that there was a thing I had a right to know. I read his letter. I read it 3 times. I went to him, in the rain, in a gown my mother did not know I had taken. I went, sir, not because I was bound. I went because I was not bound, and I wished to discover what I might do when no one was telling me. I have discovered, sir, that what I wish to do, what I, Arabella Wentworth, of my own free choice, in your presence and in the presence of my father and my mother and my sister and these gentlemen, what I wish to do is to remain in this man's company by his letter and his door for as long as he will have me, and not one moment longer." She paused. The room did not move. "If your majesty forbids it, I shall obey. I am your subject, but I shall not pretend, sir, that I do not know my own mind. I have spent 22 years pretending that I have stopped this morning." She had not raised her voice. She had not lifted her chin in any theatrical way. She had only spoken. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her amber cross caught one small fragment of chandelier light and threw it, briefly, against the cream silk of her gown. There was a silence. It was during that silence that the Duke, who had said he would not look at her in that room, looked at her. He did not mean to. He had promised himself. But the line about the letter and the line about not pretending, those two lines went into him in some place his discipline did not reach, and he turned his head very slightly, and he looked at her, and the storm blue eyes that had not moved from the king's face moved at last to hers, and they did not move away again. The Prince Regent drew breath to speak. He did not get the chance, for the king, in his high-backed chair, lifted one thin hand. The chair creaked very faintly under the small movement. The prince closed his mouth. The two white-haired advisers waited. The clerk's pen hung in the air. The king looked at Arabella. He looked at the Duke. He looked at the Duke's aunt in her travelling cloak, who had walked the length of his long gallery without permission. He looked briefly at Cecily Wentworth, who had not, in all of this, taken her hand from her sister's elbow. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Even the king went silent. It was not the silence of a man who has been silenced. It was the silence of a man who has decided that the room before him is not, at that particular moment, in need of his voice. He let it sit. He let the chandeliers burn. He let the rain, for it had begun faintly against the tall windows, be the only sound in the gallery for a count of 5 long, even breaths. Then he lifted his hand a second time in a small dismissing motion. He spoke at last very quietly to his physician and not to the room. "Take me out," he said. "I have heard enough. The matter is theirs." The physician moved. The chair moved. The two white-haired advisers fell in behind. The king passed slowly, the length of the long gallery, and as he passed Arabella, he did not look at her, but he inclined his head a very small fraction, in a manner so faint that only she and the Duke and possibly Cecily Wentworth saw it. It was not a blessing. It was something quieter than a blessing. It was a permission given by a man too old and too unwell to enjoy the giving of permissions, who had decided that afternoon that he would not, with the few breaths remaining to him, stand in the way of a young woman who had spoken plainly in his presence. The door at the far end of the gallery closed behind him. The regent, after a moment, made the small dry gesture that meant ended. It was ended. Chapter 7. The Drive Home. They did not speak in the carriage for the first half-mile. Lord and Lady Wentworth had been put into a separate carriage by the Duke's own arrangement, with the gentle, unanswerable courtesy of a man who knew that what needed to be said next did not need a chaperone. Cecily had gone with her parents. The carriage that bore Arabella and the Duke through the late September dusk towards Larkbourne was small and well-sprung, and lit by a single lantern on the front board that made of the interior a moving box of soft brown light. The Duke sat opposite her. He had not yet taken her hand. He had not yet permitted himself even to remove his glove. He looked in the half-dark like a man who had been holding his breath for 9 years and was only now beginning to discover what his body did when it was permitted, at last, to exhale. She watched him. She did not hurry him. She had learned, that summer, the gift of slowness, and she had learned it well enough by now to be able, when it was needed, to give it back. At the half-mile he spoke. "I had a speech," he said. "I have forgotten it. I am glad," she said, a small broken sound from him, half a laugh, half something else. He passed one hand across his face. The lantern light caught briefly on the small ring that had been his father's. He looked then at her, and the storm-blue eyes were no longer disciplined. They were only his. "Arabella," he said. It was the first time he had called her by her name. She did not answer at once. She removed, very deliberately, one of her own gloves. She held out her bare hand to him across the small space between them. He looked at her hand for a long moment, as a man might look at a thing he has not been certain he would ever be permitted to touch. Then he took it. His glove was still on. He laid her bare hand against his gloved one, palm to palm, and he held it there as if it were the most fragile and the most enduring thing he had held in his life. Both could be true. He bent his head. He pressed his forehead only once only for a moment to the back of her bare hand. He did not kiss it, he did not say anything more. The carriage rolled on outside. The September dusk thickened into a soft blue dark. Somewhere a curlew called, very far away over the river. She closed her free hand gently over the back of his bent head in the way she had closed it once over Quincy's nose when she had been telling him he would heal. She kept it there. It is perhaps here that we should leave them, not at an altar, not at a ball, not at a window with a ring being given, or a vow being spoken, or a great phrase being made. The great phrases had all been spoken in the long gallery, and the king himself had answered them with his silence. What was happening in the carriage was the smaller thing and the more lasting one. A bare hand and a gloved hand, a bent head, a palm laid without hurry over a man's hair, a lantern burning steady on a country road. The first long silence in 9 years that the Duke of Halcourt had been permitted by another person to keep. It was not the end of the conversation he had promised her. It was the beginning. They would have, as he had said in the rose garden in the rain, the longest conversation of either of their lives. They would not hurry it, and in the small, lantern-lit dark, with the wheels turning under them and the river running unseen beside the road, neither of them spoke, neither of them needed to. The shadows where romance lives had opened a little, just enough, and they had stepped together, slowly, inside, where every gesture is a poem.